we want to be like our ancestors who had all these parasites, they had all these microbes, they had double the number of microbes we have now. And through our modern medicine, as collateral damage, we've killed off all these guys, and we need to start seriously thinking about reversing it if we're going to ever get healthy again as a population.
I would love to start off by talking about how our transit time with our digestion correlates to health outcomes, specifically in the PREDICT study that you did. It's so fascinating.
Yeah, so the Zoe PREDICT study was a study which we did on over 1,000 people, mostly twins, and it was to look at how people respond differently to identical foods and nutrition. So it was looking at individual differences between people. And that was the whole basis of the personalized nutrition company, Zoe, which I co-founded. And basically we studied these 1,000 people, pretty more than anyone else has ever studied people in the field of nutrition, by giving them all identical meals at identical times and then following them really in great detail for the next 2 weeks. And as part of that experiment, we gave them blue muffins. They were dyed bright blue, that's a fluorescent color. They looked unnatural. And we did this because it had a food dye in it that allowed you to track how quickly food was going from your mouth out into your poo in the toilet. And this is called transit time, because we've got this really long intestine, 9 meters long. No one's really studied this at all. We've had this other measure, which I had for about 20 years, called the Bristol stool chart, which was based on a couple of 1,000 people's studies, which is just, what does your poo look like? And is it like a rabbit dropping, or is it like a cow pat? It was that's sort of rather basic. So this is the first time anyone had done a really big study of this kind. And the results were really quite amazing, much better than we thought they were, because the average transit time, and this was a group of, this is in the US and the UK, it was around 28 hours. So 28 hours it takes for the average bit of food to go from your mouth out into the toilet. But there was a huge range from about 10 hours to about a week. And many people were, going less than, twice a week. And so they had really long transit times. And it turned out there was a good correlation between the transit time and the health of your gut in terms of gut microbes and the diversity of your gut health. So it was a really nice way of that anyone can do for free to look at their individual health and get an idea of what their gut microbes look like without having to do any fancy testing. And it's people have never really discussed with each other, oh, how, hey buddy, well, what's your transit time like? Well, you don't really discuss that. In the UK or the US, it's not a topic of conversation. It is in some countries, interestingly. I worked in France and Belgium as a doctor, and people are always discussing their poo with you. And it's quite common, comes up in the conversation a lot. But it's not in the US a topic. And so knowing what's normal and what's not normal. And so the closer you were to, under 24 hours, perhaps that sweet spot between about 14 hours and maybe 20 hours, those people seem to have the healthiest gut microbes. So something about getting that things moving, the whole place is not stagnant, is definitely helpful.
What was so fascinating is that you also had some connections between this transit time and being in a healthy range connected to lower risk of type 2 diabetes, better blood sugar management, and even less visceral fat. And it's so interesting how all these things are really intimately connected, our gut, our microbiome, and these health outcomes. And so at the far end of the spectrum, we're talking about somebody holding that in there for a week, which this is not as uncommon as people might think. I remember when I was working as a nutritionist, and also I was still working in the gym from time to time, part-time, and I had a client that came in And she actually owned a restaurant, by the way. And I had a pretty good intake form at that point. I was about, 8 years into my experience. And she shared with me that she would only go number two, like every 5, 6 days. And she was also very small. And I was just like, where's this food tucked away at? And obviously she knew that this wasn't, a healthy thing. So we got this into the spectrum. But then if it's too fast, what can that be connected to if it's like 10 hours or less?
Yeah, well, I mean, then it indicates possibly you've got some gut problems. You might have irritable bowel syndrome. You might have some infections. And so if you're too fast, or you're going, and you're going like 5 or 6 times a day, then obviously that's when you need to perhaps seek help or work out you have a problem. So there's clearly a sweet spot, but I think most people don't realize what actually is average and what is normal and what's healthy. And I think most Brits and Americans are quite happy going once every 2 days. They think that's quite normal because they know other people that's what happens. But it turns out that's not healthy. That's not good. And many people think, oh, to go more than once a day, that's not healthy, but actually it is. And people who have good levels of fiber and plants in their diet, that's what generally they will do. They will be going more than once a day. So I think these sort of studies are a great wake-up call to people to discuss things that we don't normally discuss and have an idea of how we're all rather individual, but where do we fit in this normal range? And we've all got very different lengths of intestines as well. So there's not other factors. There's our body size, but then it's not always correlated to our intestinal size. And so, everyone's got to work out what really is normal for themselves. And I think that's a sort of common theme about running through all this nutrition stuff is this idea of personalization, and also working out what normal is. What is a normal diet? What's a normal transit time? What does normal gut health look like?
Yeah, you're making this stuff, which is unfortunately so taboo, bringing this to light and just getting people educated in the lexicon about this stuff as well. And our mutual friend, Will Bolsowitz, who's here with us, he's helping to do the same thing, to make this stuff, taking it from taboo to a common part of our communication, because everybody poops, but it's this kind of taboo subject. And our digestion and our poop can also give us great education and feedback about what's happening with our bodies. In the book, you actually share, of course, within the gut, we have trillions of bacteria, but we know that they play vital roles in our health. You say, in fact, quote, and this is a direct quote from the book, the individual gut microbes in the microbiome community are best thought of as little chemical factories or pharmacies. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I've sort of changed my mind on, people always ask me, how do you describe the gut microbes or the gut microbiome, which is the community of them? And we used to be trying to work out what each bug was doing. How was it? They thought maybe it was eating something else or having some direct effect on us. But it turns out they're all producing chemicals, thousands, hundreds of thousands of chemicals. And that's why we evolved with them, because the human body can only reproduce a handful of gut hormones itself to break down food, etc. And it relies on having all these other organisms inside our intestine to do the vast majority of the work for us. And we've known that they produce vitamins, vitamin B, etc. We know they produce serotonin for brain health and neurotransmitters. And there are the thousands of other chemicals they're all producing. And we now know that this is the key, because the better your pharmacy is equipped, the better your body's going to be adapted to aging and health, etc., etc. So rather than thinking about each of these microbes as individuals trying to work out, what they're eating or fighting or how they might be causing us infection, we've got to start thinking them very differently and saying, okay, what are these chemical factories doing? And how do we make sure those factories are well supplied? Because the bigger the arsenal of chemicals we've got, the more we can help our immune system, because a lot of these chemicals are going directly just to the gut lining where most of the immune cells in our body are. Most people think our immune system is somewhere, up in our neck or our bone marrow. But no, most of it's in our intestine. And it's there for a reason.
Yeah.
Because it's absolutely crucial that it's in aligned with our gut health and what we're eating. And the microbes are the intermediary between our food and our immune system. So that balance has been, we're only just realizing this, how crucial it is. And it's that immune system that we now know is not just fighting infections, but it's fighting aging, because it's mopping up a lot of the damage of aging cells. It's also picking off early cancers before they get going. And also this balance between overreaction and allergies and autoimmune disease, getting that balance right, which, as we know, in the US is a major epidemic, because we've lost this power of our immune system's gone wrong. And a lot of this is coming because of the poor health of our gut.
Wow. And also you bring up this revelation that our immune system, and it just makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, what we're putting into our mouth, our immune system needs to be there front and center. It's kind of working as like a security in a sense, to make sure and allowing in what is supposed to be in, if not calling in the troops to take out things that could be potentially dangerous.
Yeah, it's amazing when you think about it, all the different foods we eat. How does our body decide not to react against it? Like you ingest a poison or something, or you get infected, your body reacts against it. But, you have all these strange things we eat, and somehow it's dampened down. It says, don't worry, guys, no need to overreact on this one. It's just a peanut, and for most people that's fine. But when it goes wrong, it reacts against the peanut,
right,
and causes allergy. But the vast majority of the foods are brilliantly handled by our body.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. We think that it's the peanut is the villain. It's our immune system responding to the peanut. It's our bodies and its perception of threats in the way that it's, kind of reacting or overreacting.
Yeah, and peanut allergy was never a thing 50 years ago. Right. So it just doesn't really exist. And in countries that give their kids a lot of peanuts in childhood and when they're pregnant, don't really have these problems. Places like Israel, it's hardly a problem at all, and it's become a problem in the US and Western countries because I think of our gut health has just got so much worse, and that has affected our immune system, which means it's not working optimally. It's overreacting, and that's an obvious example. And there's many other ones that we can't see as clearly that are affecting us and causing this ill health.
Yeah, that's one of the crazy things. And we're often, because we're just, living our lives day to day, we don't think about the fact, like, where have all these allergies come from? The rates have skyrocketed, and also the number of things we are allergic to as a species. We're not supposed to be allergic to the world or to the environment. And yet the biggest connection that we're seeing, and thanks to your work as well, is that a lot of this increase in our allergic response to things has to do with the derangement of our gut microbiome.
Yeah, and in a way, our first instinct was to say, oh, someone's allergic, let's stop them eating everything, and let's sterilize everything and make sure there's nothing around that's going to trigger it, and try and live in a Michael Jackson type bubble.
Right.
And of course, that was completely the wrong thing to do. And it's taken ages for the science to show that, like in peanut allergy, the worst thing you can do is to not expose kids to peanuts. You want to give them peanuts at an early age in order so their body gets used to it. In small amounts. I'm not saying you give them all huge bags of peanuts, but all the countries that have done that have said even with parents who have a allergic problem, you need to do the opposite to what we've been taught. We've been taught, avoid everything, get rid of animals, never go in the countryside, keep away, sterile life. That's a recipe for disaster, and that's really what for the last 50 years we've been doing wrong as a society. We just had the wrong idea, rather than saying you need to get our body used to this stuff, we're saying, okay, modern medicine can just separate us from nature. And instead of embracing the fact that we've got these incredible immune systems that just need training.
Yeah.
And if you don't give it stuff to train, it's not going to know, what's hit it. And also, we're hitting them with antibiotics. So we're knocking out our immune system every time a kid gets antibiotics. The average kid has, at least one course of antibiotics a year now across the US, and most of it is unnecessary. And we know that some people react really badly to it and their microbes don't recover, and others don't. So you combine that, sterile living, and, the other big thing, junk food. It's not surprising we've got terrible gut health, terrible state of our microbes, which we now know is affecting our immune system. So we're just not dealing with things well because of this. And we've just hadn't put those two things together really before. And I think it's now obvious that this epidemic of allergy is related to our poor diets, our sterile living, antibiotics, all these things coming together.
It's essentially, and this is, again, so obvious, when we're not getting these exposures, it's making us less resilient. And so when we come in contact with said thing and our immune system doesn't have this training, it's going to make us more susceptible. This should be obvious. Now, with that said, if we're coming out of the gate and creating this hyper sterile environment, and we have a microbiome that's already incredibly deranged, it's essentially our immune system knows like one form of martial arts, just knows Kung Fu, but we wanted to know Krav Maga, we wanted to know, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we wanted to have this full range of, you said it earlier, the reason that I'm thinking in terms of violence is you said arsenal earlier, but the ability to handle a lot of different things. And also so that we don't even know that it's happening, right? Wouldn't that be incredible? And we have the innate immune system, but we also have the adaptive immune system. You talk about that in the book as well, getting these exposures and the ability of our immune system to learn and to be better whenever it's faced with a thing. And to do so, we need that training. But as we've moved away from basic inputs, right? When you said kind of hiding out from things, I think of the same thing in the sun, for example, right? We just get all these messages that the sun is trying to murder you, right? It only goes down at night so it can plot more ways to kill you, And of course, yes, we do have a range of, getting sunburned and increasing your risk of skin cancer. And there's also thousands of other things we don't even understand yet that the sun is having these positive, beneficial effects on our health. And so if we just we avoid the sun, we don't get enough of it. That's the culture we've become now. And we've gotten that one fear trigger and we immediately put all of our cards in. And so this brings me to what you talked about in the book as well, because it's not just the bacteria. We also have the virome, our collection of trillions of viruses, and the microbiome. In particular, you mentioned a subcategory, yeasts, within this cascade of fungi we have. And how yeasts are actually, certain strains are important for helping to reduce inflammation in the body and other health benefits. But yet, when we hear the word yeast, we think it's a bad word when it comes to the human body. And inherently, we try to kill all of it, which you say is a huge mistake.
Yeah, there's still clinics everywhere offering to get rid of candida from your body and eliminate it. And yet, at least 50% of us have detectable amounts of these yeasts in our intestines, probably more. And it's this tendency for humans to try and reduce everything to something black and white, good v evil. And also this hubris about humans being in control of everything. That, modern medical science, your MD can sort it all out for you. We got powerful drugs, we can zap this guy, no problem, you'll be cured. That's the old-fashioned mentality of also curing everything with tablets and things. So, you detect something, you get rid of that guy, and you're sorted. And we now know that we've been killing the wrong guys. We've been killing off our bacteria every time we use antibiotics. All these studies killing off these yeasts have ended up disastrously.
cue the ambulance.
Yes.
Driving by.
They're coming for us. And a great example is in the Zoe studies, we've now got over 50,000 poop samples, which we looked at great detail, the microbiome, and we discovered that about a quarter of the UK population have this parasite called blastocysts, which, if you look up any medical book, will say, oh, it's associated with bloody diarrhea, traveler's diarrhea, take this parasite drug, very nasty one, to sort of deworm you and get rid of it. And it turns out that it's associated with good health in all these populations. And we've looked around the world now, and it's a sign of perfect health. And if you've got this parasite, you have less internal fat, less obesity, your blood pressure is lower, your lipids levels are better, your blood sugar control is slightly better, and this parasite is doing something really good in your body, and you really want to have this guy on your side. And only a small proportion of people do it. In the US, it's only 4 or 5% of the population that have it. Probably been killed off by all these antibiotics and junk food and whatever. But if you've got it, you're much healthier than the people who don't have it. So I think we're totally changing our mind on who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, through this modern science. And it's really a time to reevaluate everything, really, our whole mindset about health. And, a bit like the allergy question, killing the wrong guys. And I think we've just got the whole thing wrong. So we want to be like our ancestors who had all these parasites. They had all these microbes. They had double the number of microbes we have now. And through our modern medicine, as collateral damage, we've killed off all these guys. And we need to start seriously thinking about reversing it if we're going to ever get healthy again as a population.
That's so fascinating. When it comes to, again, yeast, and even you just said the P word, dirty P word, parasites, and really reevaluating our perspective on these things. Because if we're talking about this blastocysts, a parasite in particular, it's been around a long time, much longer than us, potentially.
100% of our ancestors had it.
Yeah.
So we basically probably evolved with it. And we don't get it. We're not born with it, so we acquire it in the first few years of life. But obviously, in our new sterile environment, we've stopped acquiring it. And that's, kind of spooky that very quickly, in about 50 years, we're changing our bodies. Yeah. Because if we think of our gut microbiome as a virtual organ, like our liver or our heart, and it's only half the capacity it was 50 years ago, that's pretty frightening.
Yeah. And the key word here, symbiotic relationship, right? Symbiotic. And you made a reference to this earlier, essentially killing off the good guys. And then at the end of the day, what are we left with? A bunch of villains, potentially, and you got this superhero team of villains, or a super villain team, and wondering why our health is in such poor state. Now, this leads to something really interesting. You shared in the book how these particular microbes also communicate with our brain. They're sending out chemical signals, chemical messengers through our nervous system, and basically informing us on what to feed them. Now, we might think we're just having a craving for something, but there's this symbiotic relationship happening. And now there's this positive aspect to it, but then what if you have dysbiosis and you have a lot of pathogenic bacteria kind of running your system, and you think you've got a craving for some ding-dongs or, some ho-hos or whatever. Do they have this stuff in the UK? No ding-dongs?
Well, is that Twinkies or?
Ding-dongs are like little cupcakes. They look like hockey pucks.
Okay.
All right. Ho-hos are like circular. Never mind. And I think it's an insult, actually. The processed food company's like, ding-dong, ho-ho, you're still going to eat it, But the UK has some strange name stuff too. Bangers and mash, Well,
bangers and mash sounds healthier than your ding-dongs.
It definitely does.
But,
it definitely does. And it is. It's been around much longer time than a ho-ho.
But we have donuts, and we have, all kinds of rubbish as well. So,
Oh, we got a rubbish drop on here. This is awesome. So, with that being said, this information coming from our gut, informing us on what foods to eat to feed them. Let's talk a little bit about that.
yeah, so if you think each of your microbes has its own evolution, and like we've evolved, but it takes multiple generations for us to change our genes and evolve, whereas some of our gut microbes can reproduce every 30 minutes. Okay, so they're living hard and fast and furious, these guys, right? They're, having sex and having babies, and it's all happening, inside an hour. And so their genes are changing. And if you get an overgrowth of, say, particular bugs that like living in an inflammatory environment. Okay, so they like, burgers and fries and things that will generate lots of fats and things that will generate a little bit of inflammation, which is sort of the stress molecules you get in your gut. Then they will evolve to send out chemical signals to get more of it if they can. And that's what we know happens in some animal models, that by growing certain microbes, they'll send off chemicals to say, send me more of that food. And they've done all kinds of really fancy experiments to change the way insect behavior works, so that rather than picking sugars, they'll go for protein, or vice versa, just by switching around their microbes. So they've proven that your microbes can certainly determine your choice of foods, how much sweet, how much protein. And we think the same happens to some extent in humans. Haven't been able to prove it, but it makes absolute sense. And it probably is why people get into this junk food cycle, where the only microbes that are still living, because these are just living off a bit of fat that's down there, and other chemicals that they're living off in a very inflamed environment. Their natural evolution, if they've been there for years or so, they've probably evolved chemicals to say, give me more of this food, because of this symbiotic relationship with the host. Because they're just sitting there waiting for you to eat another burger, and they might well send signals saying, well, I don't want any of that salad, I don't want that gherkin. Just give me more of the, I want more of that bread and more of that that burger. So that's what we think happens. We haven't proven it, but it's certainly in the insect world, where you can do these experiments by swapping foods around. It's very clear it works, and it sort of makes sense, because the microbe, like us, is evolving, but they're just doing it so much faster. And so I think it's one of the reasons that it is hard for people to break these habits, and to go from very unhealthy diets to healthy diets. Sometimes if you've got the wrong set of microbes, they're not going to be happy for the first few weeks. And it's also why people with some gut problems do find it hard to suddenly shift to a high fiber diet early on. They're not geared up for it, so they have to be, and they often get put off because they feel unwell when they first start. So I think it's all part of this idea that having lost all the healthy microbes, you don't have those guys there breaking down the foods as you'd like them as well.
Oh man, it's so fascinating. And to think that some microbes like an inflamed environment, they thrive there. They like a little hell in the belly.
Well, like humans as well, there's people who like criminal activity and life on the streets, and the adrenaline, and there's others who want the quiet life, and others. So we all evolve to fit an environment. If there's a different environment, how are you going to survive in that environment? You have to adapt, and this is what these guys are doing. So our job as the host is to give these guys a really good, cool environment to live in, that is healthy, that would allow the good guys to grow, and then they produce the healthy chemicals that are really great for our immune systems, so we can flourish. And we've just got to realize that we have this power, And the food choices we make every day are the most important ones we can make for our health. And by understanding why and introducing this whole concept of these gut microbes, I think it makes it easier and makes it more relevant to really understand what you're doing every time you put food in your mouth. It's not just a tube. It's just not just, flushing out the system and not just providing calories. It's much more important, much more subtle than that.
Yeah. And I think keeping in mind too, by reading your book, this is one of the things that jumped out. There's such diversity, potential, of course that diversity has been going down in our modern culture, but understanding there are going to be some microbes that all of us have that might want to do a little B&E, breaking and entering. Some crime, like you just said, is kind of a representation. Our inner world is a reflection of our outer world in a sense. And it's really about creating conditions where health and good relationship, good community is thriving overall. And so it can keep other stuff in check, right? And with that said, it's not just our microbes, obviously, that are having influence on our taste preferences. One of my favorite parts of the book is when you dig in on how we taste, how we experience taste and flavor, which there's a little bit of a difference between those two things in and of themselves. But can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's so fascinating, because I remember being in elementary school and talking about our taste buds and just how distorted our view is previously into where we are with science today and understanding how we taste.
Yeah, well, so it was only when I got really deep into this that I started to understand, because I'd been taught at medical school that we all had these little areas of our tongue that were, for the different taste areas, and the bitter and the sweet and the sour. And it turns out that's all rubbish. It was just invented by some German professor, and he made up the results. So that's the first thing to realize, that it's actually much more sophisticated than that. And the human can detect incredible numbers of combinations of different tastes. We're really good at it. But without our nose, we're pretty useless if we just have our tongue itself. So we do most of our tasting through our nose and the passages at the back of the nose, the retronasal passages, and virtually everything we do with taste and food is determined by that area there. And so anyone can do an experiment by putting a clip on their nose and blindfolding yourself and putting different bits of food on your tongue. And I did this, and you really can hardly tell what you're eating at all. And it's really impressive when you can't tell the difference between an onion, a lemon, a watermelon, a bit of salami. It really makes you understand the importance of smell in our system, which we've sort of forgotten. But that's clearly evolved to a very fine point. So we always think of dogs, etc., as being the best sniffers in the world. But we're pretty good compared to most animals. So, and that means we're very careful about what we put in our mouths. And so huge evolution has gone into this whole way of tasting. But at the same time, we do know that there are these super tasters, and there are people who really find bitter tastes, pick them up much more easily, and they find it harder. So it explains why some people find it much harder to drink coffee than others, or eat kale or Brussels sprouts, because they are tasting differently to perhaps you or I. And there is this much bigger range in how we're perceiving things. It's like you can't judge how that tastes to you.
Yeah.
We use a bit of language description. Well, that was kind of sweet, kind of nice, kind of tangy, but you've got no clue how each of us is responding to this stuff. So realized how individual it is, but how finely tuned our evolution is. And it was really, really fascinating science to uncover all that. There is actually a much bigger range of tasting, and that's why it is harder to get some people to eat salads than others. And some people don't eat chilies very easily. They find that really difficult. And others do have a sweeter tooth. And so we all start at a different point. But what's also clear is that if you expose people early on to these healthy foods, they will adapt. May start at a different point, but nearly everyone can adapt. And I'm a big fan of kimchi, the Korean spicy cabbage, and most Americans, wouldn't immediately say, "Oh yes, kimchi for breakfast, that's great." And there's a huge variety about whether they like all that spiciness or the chili or whatever. But every Korean kid gets given kimchi as soon as they're weaning, and they spit it out a couple of times. It's a big thing in Korea. They show these photos of the little babies spitting out their first kimchi, but they keep giving it, and in the end, they all love it. So I think, although we've got this big diversity, we can train everyone to eat, in a healthy way. We don't have to immediately say, "Oh, let's just give them baby food and this rubbish." And we shouldn't have children's menus. They should start to learn early age, what good food tastes like.
The kimchi rite of passage.
Yeah, well, perhaps we should all start, doing the same thing, because they've got something right. They're about the only sort of rapidly developed country that is stayed healthy and is not obese, and because they've kept this food culture going, and this amazing culture of having kimchi at virtually all their meals, which is a probiotic, and we'll talk about it because it's prebiotic and probiotic. It's full of microbes, yeah. And it also preserves their food culture. So really important at all levels, and gets kids very early on to be able to taste bitter and sour and spicy food, that steers them away from that sort of sweet, gooey, dairy flavors that we've gone for in the West. Just keeping kids on breast milk for life, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is something remarkable that happens with that fermentation process. I actually noted a study in my last book, Eat Smarter. They had test subjects to consume either the kimchi, the fermented version, or the ingredients that hadn't been fermented, the cabbage and the radish, the carrot, whatever the case might be. And it was so fascinating that there was a significant improvement in metabolic health when they were given the fermented version. There's something about those microbes and the interaction with our cells, our human cells, that it really points to the fact that this is something that we need. And when I used to work at the university gym, I would ask people, I was after a couple of years, but because I'm working at a university, I'm working with people from all over the world. And eventually I started asking people, like, what kind of fermented food do you have in your culture? And every culture had cultured foods, every single one, right? And even the word culture is there. And I thought that was so fascinating, And
what did the Americans have?
Pizza rolls, So yeah, that's the thing. And if we can start to borrow, because we're all, America's known as this melting pot, and start to borrow from traditions that have interacted and or our relatives, our close ancestors. That's one of the ways I found much more success with helping people to get well. It wasn't having them do what I think they should do, but what's your lineage? If you're from this particular region in Kenya, Nairobi, and your ancestors were eating goat, nyama, and chapati, or if you're from Ethiopia, you have this fermented bread, right? Maybe let's add some of that in, and they're like, what I really love when my grandmother was, let's add some of that in, a little bit less, pizza rolls.
Yeah, well, there's an idea the Second World War changed a lot of things, and before the Second World War, sauerkraut was really quite a big thing in the US, and because it was associated with being German, it was like banned, like the Freedom Fries.
Typical Americans.
Yeah, they just said, okay,
we kick it all out the window.
We're not having that, Nazi stuff. We've got to ban it, and it's not American to eat it anymore. And sadly, that's a bit of the legacy. because it was pretty big apparently in the 30s and 40s. People were making it themselves. There was, it was a thing everyone could make in their house, and I embracing these other ferments as other countries have done, really important. And I think the science is now showing us that this isn't just folklore that these were healthy. There have been some really good experiments very recently. There was one done in Stanford by colleagues of mine, and just in 6 to 8 weeks, people having three to four portions of fermented foods a day dramatically reduced their inflammation levels in their body and really had a big impact on their immune system. And this is one of the first really detailed studies that's done this properly, which sort of matches the big population studies. But I think it is really important that people understand how important this is. On top of a healthy plant-based diet, to have some of these foods regularly is really vital. And most of human history we've done this, and people don't realize how much fermented food we used to have before we invented the refrigerator. It was the way to preserve food and keep it going and get these regular supply of microbes into us that I think probably we evolved to eat. And probably why beer was invented as at the same time as bread, because we were using these yeasts and using their products, and they had this really powerful effect on our immune system. So I'm a big fan of fermenting, and I think everyone should learn how to do something about it.
You specifically mentioned how the environment can shift taste as well, and you feeling like you have a certain sensory intelligence for tasting beers under certain condition, right? And this leans back into understanding a little bit more how our sense of smell is involved in that interaction. And so much so that you shared this really fascinating study on, if you think about this logically, if our sense of smell is so tied to our survival and how it evolved, it's just so that we're selecting healthy foods, right? And that capacity to smell diminishes once we hit a certain age bracket. You mentioned 75 years old, essentially. There's some downturn. But you shared this study, and this was a 2014 study, and this is directly from your book. It looked at 3,000 Americans aged 57 to 85 and tested them with 5 classic smells: rose, leather, fish, orange, and peppermint, and followed them for 5 years. Those test subjects who had problems smelling had a 4-fold risk of death from all causes. That is crazy, crazy. Now, this can evoke some fear here, because just like, I don't want to lose my sense of smell. But you also shared in the book that we have the capacity to essentially exercise our smell, exercise our taste buds by exposing ourselves intentionally to multiple odors and increasing the number of nasal nerve fibers. That's so cool.
Yeah, it's a bit like going to a gym and working out, get extra muscles. Doing the same for smell and using that bit of the brain and expanding it is really important. In the same way, people try to do, crossword puzzles to stop dementia. I think the smell is also an important part of our life, and that means having a big variety of foods. And again, this coming back to this recurrent theme of diversity of foods rather than this narrow range of beige stuff, which is easy to eat. Let's challenge our palates and nose more. And it's interesting, since I wrote the book, I remember my mother, who was in her late 80s, suddenly lost her sense of smell. And she went through various tests. They couldn't find anything wrong with it. And 2 years later, she had a mild stroke and got dementia. And it was really, an anecdote like that is quite striking. That shows how important smell is as a sort of first sign of perhaps damage to our brain, and how crucial it is to us as humans. And we've sort of neglected that bit of our bodies. So yeah, perhaps we should start some smell gyms, as part of this, to get us back to where our ancestors were. Because I'm sure if you go back to some of these ancestral tribes, they're a lot better at this than we are. We just go to the store and buy stuff and assume it's fine, whereas we'd be sniffing it and looking at it in much more detail, I think, if we didn't have civilization.
Yeah, ding dongs don't change in their smell,
No.
So, and the thing is, you truly quite a bit about this subject, because utilizing the data that you collected through Zoe, you were actually able to really help to pinpoint the fact that one of the early symptoms that we could find as far as COVID-19 was a loss of smell. And your data actually helped to get the word out about this. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also, if you can, talk about how the process of losing our smell can disrupt our taste of things and also potentially lead to depression.
Yeah, so we'd started the company Zoe about 6 years ago, and we'd just launched our first personalized nutrition product when COVID broke out, and all our studies had to stop. It was very difficult to carry on working. So in London at the time, the engineering team were sort of stuck for things to do, and cycling home one day, I came up with the idea of repurposing the nutrition app for COVID and seeing if we could get a real-time idea of how much COVID was out there and what was going on when there was, if you remember, there was no testing, it was chaos in sort of March 2020. You couldn't see a doctor, fear everywhere. And we launched this in 5 days. The team at Zoe were incredible and had no idea whether anyone would download it or not. But in 24 hours, we had 1 million downloads. And, within 2 weeks, 2.5 million. It was phenomenal. All our servers broke and everything. You can imagine the chaos. And people loved it because they had a chance to actually interact with each other and perform as citizen scientists. And it ended up being the world's biggest citizen science project on health. And it was a fantastic success, and people reporting whether they were getting tested or not, what their symptoms were every day, what was happening in their local area. And we started expanding the list of symptoms, and very quickly saw that as on top of it was fever and cough, if you remember, and shortness of breath were the only things were talked about from the original Chinese variant. Suddenly, a third of people reporting loss of smell, and those people all had the positive tests in our subgroup working in hospitals, etc. So we went out there and said, this is a real symptom. And, it went around the world, and because we had such a big database, the WHO believed us and changed their criteria. The US, did the same, and it had a major impact. And so suddenly people who maybe didn't have a fever, just had loss of smell, which were some people who were otherwise infecting people and going to work, etc., suddenly said, okay, I'm going to stay at home, I'm infectious. So that was really, I'm really proud of that bit of citizen science. It happened so fast as well. And we were months before the government had actually sort of, geared up to do anything. And the other thing we showed was what the impact of this loss of smell was. People hadn't experienced this before, and and a lot of them were really worried what was going on in there, and they lost the will to eat. Many people got totally anorectic, lost all interest in food, and became very depressed. So that was a really marked thing. And you realize how important taste is and smell is for humans. And many people had this that went on for months, and they were the most badly affected psychologically. Many people lost their jobs in restaurants, etc. They just couldn't taste. We had someone who was in the wine business was just useless, couldn't function. And long term, they've worked out that people who had long COVID, this is one of the sort of worst prognostic signs, because it often meant that there was quite major brain damage, because the virus had actually entered into the brain and was actually knocking off the cells that are responsible for the smell at the base of the brain. And it was a big wake up call, and it just emphasized how important food and taste is to our overall health, and the enjoyment of food as well. How crucial that is. And that, to me, was the sort of number one factor, that, food isn't fuel. It's so much more than that, and it's so much more of what defines us as humans.
Yeah. And this is another one of those kind of catchy things to say, is to eat to live, don't live to eat, right? And I understand the principle, eating for a purpose, to fuel your body, all these things. But the reason that we are driven to eat foods is because of the experience. We are hardwired to enjoy flavors and to enjoy the experience of eating. And you spend time with the Hadza, for example, and seeing what they're driven towards naturally, without any kind of marketing machine behind it trying to tell them what to eat. There's a certain flavor profile, in particular honey, for example, which in our culture we might think, shouldn't eat a lot of sugar. Their rates of, to even say rates of diabetes or heart disease is kind of, it's almost non-existent essentially, and for me, I think, and I'm wanting to shift this around as well, to be intentional, of course, about our food selection, but also understand that if you really want to help people, we have to understand and leverage the fact that we love food. And that's a good thing. That's okay. Let's heighten the intelligence of the system, support the system, because right now it's being manipulated on so many different ends of the spectrum. And so I want to ask you about this. You mentioned earlier a little bit about how ultra-processed food consumption is disrupting our microbiome. According to the BMJ, about 60% of American adults' diet is now made of ultra-processed foods. For children, it's worse. It's almost 70%, and that's according to JAMA, just published some data on that. Now, we've got the microbiome impact, but one of the things I don't think we think about is the fact that even when you were talking about the immune system earlier, it's not only what we're feeding our microbiome, but it's what we're making our tissues out of, and even our immune cells are being made of the stuff that we're eating. We really don't even understand the ramification of what happens when you go from eating a real food, something that's close to its natural state, to eating something that is so distant from anything real or natural, and your body's trying to use that to build tissues, to build your immune cells, to even create the communication between these things. And so the question I want to ask you, with all of this disruption taking place, and the popular narrative is telling people that if you want to get healthy, you just need to manage your calories, right? It's a calorie game. It's a energy expenditure versus what you're taking in. What's the truth here when it comes to our association with food and calories? Is monitoring, micromanaging our calories going to help us to lose weight efficiently, or does the food quality matter a lot?
Well, you sort of know the answer, don't you? But the numerous studies have shown that diets based on reducing calories alone certainly don't long-term help weight loss for the majority of people. They bounce right back. And that's because our bodies are adapted to counter major reductions in calories by reducing metabolism, by reducing our exercise outputs, and having other compensatory mechanisms to make us hungrier. Okay, so we just eat more. And there's been a number of recent studies about ultra-processed foods showing that compared to real foods, when you eat them, it makes you hungrier. Even with identical calories. So just having this fake food that's, just they're repurposed extracts of other foods, stuck them together to make them look like food. They're designed to make you overeat by 10 to 20% more every day. So that's been shown scientifically in proper studies run in an unbiased way. So if you rely totally on calories, and you ignore the quality, and you're telling people it doesn't matter what you eat the cheap stuff, that has a shelf life of 3 months and you can microwave. It's the same. That's a total fallacy, and it's one that the food companies have wanted us to believe, because they can put on their packets low in calories, low in fat, high in vitamins, and people think it is actually good for you. And it is really bad for you because it has no good nutrients and will make you overeat. So the quality of the food is really important, and those foods are also bad for your gut microbes. So identical calories, very different profile on your body. They get absorbed much quicker. They don't trigger the fullness hormones in your body, so you carry on eating. They go straight into your bloodstream, give you sugar spikes and fat spikes much faster. And there's little fiber, so they don't nourish your gut microbes. So you're not getting extra species. And they've got these extra chemicals in them. Because they're fake food, they've got to add all these extra chemicals to give it its texture. So they have glues in there, emulsifiers, gums, and they can stick your microbes together. They're not used to this stuff because they never, in their millions of years of evolution, have never encountered it. They don't know what to do when they encounter an artificial sweetener, which are generally derived from paraffin and the petrol industry. So none of our ancestors were eating this stuff, and so our microbes, they try and break it down, and they produce all kinds of weird substances instead as a byproduct, which cause havoc with our normal communication system with immune cells.
Endotoxemia.
All kinds of stuff can happen. We know very little, other than there's a major disruption to our gut microbes when we have these artificial substances in our gut, which we were told were inert. It just 0 calories, passes straight through you, no problem. It's a win-win. Well, it's not. And we know also that people having artificial sweeteners, if they swap, say, regular sodas for diet sodas, on average, no one loses weight. So the body compensates. Something else is going on. It's kind of bad. So the whole story about the calorie is there to just mislead us and camouflage the poor quality of the food that's being passed off to the average American. And I think that's really important, that we get back to this concept of real food, real quality, and people understand the reasons behind it. And I think it isn't just a question of the old stories of calories and fats and sugars and salts. That's a little bit of the problem, but that's an easy one for the food companies to get around. They just reformulate it. But it's the quality, it's the fact that it's not real food. That's the major problem, and that's ultra processed food is taking over the Western world, and we can see the effects, and it's going to bankrupt us all. I mean, it's totally unsustainable, and yet no one wants to do anything about it.
In particular, with your data on twins, identical twins, and being able to see how calories can impact different individuals, but we're talking about identically, as far as their genes, genetically identical to individuals. You would think that eating the same foods, being in the same environment, they're going to have the same health outcomes. But you saw a variety of different health outcomes with physical and mental health. So can you talk a little bit about that aspect and how the microbiome even is another kind of epicaloric controller, determining what calories do in the body?
Yeah, so I've been studying twins for 30 years, and I was always looking for reasons why identical twins often got different diseases, why one died earlier than the other, and they didn't both get the same cancers, didn't both get depression or autoimmune disease. It's always a bit of a mystery to me why these genetic clones live together. Everything should happen the same. And it was only when I started studying the gut microbiome that I realized that was the first thing I'd ever seen in like 25 years that was different between identical twins. Their microbes, when you looked at them, they only shared about 25% of their species. It's quite remarkable. And so for me, that was a big aha moment to say how important the gut microbiome is. And that's really what led to this whole idea that we're all very individual in our gut microbes, so therefore we must have very different responses to food. We didn't know that for sure until we did the Zoe Predict study, where we took 1,000 of these, mostly twins, and gave them all identical foods at the same time of day and monitored how they responded. And it turns out there was a 10 to 20-fold difference in blood response in sugar, insulin, and fat levels to an identical meal. And
with identical twins.
Yeah, well, on average, the average population was still over 10-fold, but even in identical twins, there were still big differences. And so you'd have one twin that would respond well to fats and the other one would respond poorly, and vice versa with sugar. So a lot of this difference was explained by the differences in the microbiome. And so suddenly this idea that one size fits all was blown out of the water. And the idea that also, I was biased, I was a geneticist, that I could explain this with genes. That's why I put twins in the study. I said, I'm sure genes will be a big explanation for this. Only a very small explanation, and not even worth measuring the genes to try and predict outcomes. So we suddenly had this really new concept of our individual differences to foods being driven by things that weren't our genes and were things like our gut microbiome that you could influence. It was also things like sleep and exercise and other factors. So it's not saying it's only the microbiome, but just the fact that really changed the paradigm. And also, I think, just the huge differences. If you and I tested eating the same muffin or donut, we'd have a very different response. And that determines then how do you then pick what's the best food for you to eat. It's going to be different for everybody. And that really was the basis then of going on from those studies to have our commercial product, the Zoe Personalized Nutrition Program. Because if you didn't have those differences, you'd have nothing to play with. But we were able to predict with machine learning models, based on those tests, how you would then respond to any meal and give you a score for all your foods. And I go into the book about, my own scores and how my sort of journey as I, changed my ideas about what was good for me and what wasn't. Suddenly, having some tools to do that with rather than just my gut feeling, which unfortunately turned out to be not very correct.
That's such a poetic thing to say, the gut feeling, on top of all this. And, this is really pointing to something, again, very logical, but we've been doing much the opposite, which is this should be based on you as an individual. There's no two human beings that are truly identical, in particular, if we're talking about this microbial cascade that we all carry. And the genes of these bacteria, for example, far outnumber ours in some aspects. And also you mentioned that replication process can happen so quickly, and the shifting, the ebb and flow of what's going on there. And it's just such a bigger picture, but yet we like to think that we've got it all figured out. And that's part of the problem.
Well, we're so dumb, we think it's easy, and we think our problem is we've underestimated food. We said, it's easy. Food, it's about calories. It's about saturated fat. It's about the sugars. That's all you need to do. Or sort this out. All you got to do is cut out lectins, cut out gluten, do this. Reductionism. We're so clever. It's all about this vitamin. Just take vitamin D, you'll be fine. Vitamin C, injections, all sorted. It's nonsense. Humans are incredibly complicated. Food has over 30,000 chemicals in it. Our gut microbes convert that food into hundreds of thousands of different molecules we still know very little about. And all of us produce different ones, and they go into our blood in different ways. So we're much more complex machines than we've given ourselves credit for. And the idea, we can divide our food into three sort of sections, and that's it. Are you high fat, high carb? It's just rubbish. We've got to start thinking much more holistically and realize that, yes, we need to, even with the Zoe program, where we look at fats and sugars and microbiome, they're just the things we can measure at the moment. it's pretty good, but there might be other stuff in 10, 20 years' time. There's some other technology that shows us, there's other bits in that picture as well. But at least we're moving in that right direction towards understanding this human complexity that is, it's sort of fun, because it also, I think, always keeps coming back to the same thing, that the best bet is to eat a diverse diet. It's to have as many different plants as you can. It's to have these fermented foods with all kinds of different bugs in them, these probiotics. It's to sort of throw everything at you, increase your sense of smell and taste, and try everything. It's that variety. Variety is the spice of life, and I think that's what we keep coming back to as the way to deal with our complexity.
Let's go to the smell gym,
Let's work out. Yeah.
Let's work it out. So this has been incredibly fascinating, and just to unpack this, and if you could, because I think folks are going to feel motivated to focus on improving the health of their microbiome. What are 3 things that people can do in their own lives to support a healthy microbiome?
Well, the top 3 things you can do. The first is to have a diverse series of plants on your plate every week. And we did some studies a while back with the British and American Gut Project that showed 30 plants a week is the sweet spot. It's not as tough as you think, because that includes nuts and seeds and herbs and spice mixes. And it's quite achievable if you just, have a few hacks. Like, I have a jar of nuts and seeds mixed that gives me about 8 to 10 plants in a go. So, you can get around it. Second thing is to try and eat brightly colored plants. We haven't discussed this much, but the polyphenols in the plants, these are sort of phytochemicals, the defense chemicals that all plants have to some extent, but some have lots of them. And they tend to be really brightly colored ones, and they're ones that are also bitter. And those defense chemicals end up being really good for our gut microbes. They're like rocket fuel for your gut microbes. So that's why coffee's good for you. It's not the caffeine, it's the polyphenols in there. And that's why dark chocolate is good for you. It's why nuts are good for you. And it's why olive oil is so good for you. But also berries and other plants like that. Then fermented foods. We discussed having small amounts regular and often to boost your immune system, really important, and boost your gut health. And I think we evolved to eat them, and we've just forgotten how to do that. And try and eat as many different ones as you can. Don't just have the same yogurt every day. Mix it up. Get some of these other, I call them the 4Ks. The kefir, kombucha, kraut and kimchi. Just think of different ones you can have in small amounts. They're the top 3, and I'd add in 2 more. One is, we haven't really discussed it, but giving your gut a rest. So time-restricted eating is actually beneficial for your gut microbes. So if you can ideally leave 14 hours when they're not working, they really respond well metabolically. And so we've done some big studies of this, looking at over 100,000 people, and generally people eating in a 10-hour window and having 14 hours not eating, most people do pretty well on that, and that helps their metabolism. And finally, cut out as much as possible ultra-processed food.
It's pretty simple. You abbreviated ultra-processed food in the book UPF, and I flipped it around and put foods ultra-processed, and that made it F'd up, or F up foods. And it really is it's pretty simple, making that shift. And what I really love about your work too is that it's not an all or nothing thing, and you're promoting a lot of variety, and not saying that ultra processed foods are not going to be something that we might be exposed to, but just shifting that ratio, like you just mentioned, targeting 30 different plant foods a week. You can get 10 in a meal pretty easily, especially if we're talking about spices, cayenne pepper, cinnamon, all these different things, oregano, basil. And you've got these wonderful sections at the end of the book, and kind of giving a masterclass on different food categories, right? And answering a lot of questions, dispelling a lot of myths, It's a wonderful book, Food for Life. Can you let everybody know where to pick up a copy of the book and also where they can get more information about Zoe?
Sure. So online retailers have Food for Life, so usual ones like Amazon, the place to go for that. And it is in Kindle and Audible form as well. And for Zoe, go to joinzoe.com, and people can sign up and get their program, test their gut microbes, test their sugar responses, along with all the other tens of thousands of people who have already done it, and see how they get on. And you may be able to give a discount if you give them the right code.
All right, we'll put that in for the show notes for everybody, a special, which this is news to me. Thank you so much. We'll put a note for a discount for everybody. Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
And you see that your blood sugar goes up 80 points, which would be a really high rise. You can say immediately in one time of just checking this food with your continuous glucose monitor, this food is likely causing a big insulin surge in me. And we know that one of the many functions of insulin is that it blocks fat burning in the body.